Well, we moved here in '99 and had just gotten used to the sound of the creek as constant as the feel of air on your skin when I woke up one night in 2002 and realized something was badly wrong. And what was wrong was there were no water noises. In the summer of 2002, Goose Creek went totally dry. The old timers who have lived here all their lives, were in their 90s, had never seen that creek go dry. I feared that we'd never see the minnows and the insects and the birds that feed on those insects. I thought the whole ecological cycle was broken, but nature is more resilient than that, and by the next year the creek was full of life again. But I think that's an important lesson for us to know in Floyd County, is that our water can disappear. 2002 was the year that 600 wells had to be re-drilled because they went dry.
We have houses down practically every mile of every road. As that continues to fill in and then people run out of water, where are you going to take water? You know, you're just going to take it to the first mile. There's a subdivision not far from town here that in the last big drought in 2001, 2002 had that very situation where they were running out of water. They didn't have public water, and when one neighbor would drill a deeper well, the other ones would go dry, and it would be on down the line. Finally, one was a farmer, and he brought in a water truck, and then thankfully it started raining. But I think people think it's far-fetched here, that we're somehow water-rich and above this, but it isn't far-fetched. It's very real here, and it's something that we can't take for granted.
All right, let's talk about water. All the water comes from the sky. When you're the highest landscape, then you're dependent on rainfall for your water. And how long water is stored in the soil or in the rock is a function of the structure of that system.
Floyd seems to be a pretty typical fractured rock environment where you're going to have relatively small reserves of water that are susceptible to drought conditions. So if you have a really bad drought, especially over several years, you'll probably see wells go dry.
So Floyd County and the Blue Ridge and the Piedmont and all these ancient landscapes, they don't have an aquifer. An aquifer is a body of water which is trapped where you drill a hole and everybody gets the water at the same place.
You can date water and figure out when, pull water out of a well and say, when did this water fall as precipitation? And if you look at that in areas like Floyd, in fractured rock environments, they're usually around like 20 to 50 years old. So it's not that old in groundwater. If you went out to the coastal plain of Virginia, you'd be looking at water that was thousands of years old. If you had a really severe drought, the kind of drought that only happens once every 50 or 100 years, and none of your wells went dry, and you didn't even see any change in the water, then you're probably looking at water that's been hanging around for a lot longer. And so the levels aren't as volatile, so it's not, you know, if you have a dry spell, the water levels don't drop. But if you have a smaller reserve of water that's getting actively recharged from precipitation that's happening like on the yearly or monthly scale, then you're going to see, when you have a drought, the water levels are going to go down. You're going to see wells going dry, and that's what they've seen in Floyd. And that's typical of a fractured rock environment. They're usually pulling from these fracture networks that are varying sizes, but most of the time they're not very big.
It's like Legos. When the Legos go together, that is the rock. The areas between where the Legos attach, that is the fractured network. And if you have a big gap, you have more water stored. If you have a small gap, you have less water stored. The big gaps move water faster, the small gaps move water slower.
So yeah, there's plenty of water in Floyd. I mean, if you just do a water balance and look at how much water is coming in via precipitation and leaving in the streams, there's probably plenty of water for that town to persist for a very long time. The problem is finding that water.
All the water we have right here, I've been on sites like this where you had all this water and you drilled a well and there was no water.
Even if you use the best characterization techniques that you find, you might end up with a dry well that's not going to produce enough. We had records of several attempts to get water in Floyd that never panned out. You spend $20,000, $30,000 on a well and it's dry.
Now, a lot of soils have been studied, a lot of springs have been studied in Floyd County, and what we've discovered is that the average spring water is between 3 and 7 years old. So that means if you have a 7-year drought, that spring is not going to be producing because the water didn't get there to replace the water which is coming out.
And even with the best, most expensive methods of binding water that there are, it's hit or miss. And then there's also, you have to consider, even if there's plenty of water, if it's contaminated, it's useless. So it's not necessarily that it's a water poor area, it's just not necessarily easy to get to.
Now, the town of Floyd is very unusual because all of its water comes from wells. I think there's 6 wells there. There's a discharge permit for 150,000 gallons of water per day, which all comes out of the ground, runs through those people's houses, goes through the treatment plant, and all goes to the creek. So in a period of very dry weather, we don't have recharge, we have a lot of discharge. You are going to see those wells dropping in both productivity and the amount of water stored in the system. It goes without saying. Now here's the big question. If you're on a landscape like that and you drill a well, what's your impact? And I'm going to tell you it's a very small impact because if you have a septic system, the water you pump out of the ground goes back through the house, through the drain field, and back to the ground, and you lose none of that water. None of that water is lost. Unless you're in a sewage system where you treat the water and discharge it to a creek like the PSA does at Dodds Creek. That water, all the water you pump out of the ground, goes through a house and is lost forever until someone in Mississippi sees it. Most people have the benefit of having a site like this where you can discharge water to the ground and the water goes back to that well, that source, within about 3 years. So what's interesting is soil has the ability to renovate sewage. Good soil with good root zones is able to take water and render it clean within 18 inches. So the idea is, if you're developing a site and you want to make sure that you've got water for the future, then build a septic system, because no water is lost unless you're washing the car and the water and the hose runs that goes down the driveway into a creek. That water is lost forever. If you're watering a garden, if you're growing crops, if you're irrigating crops, that water evaporates and is lost forever. The only way you can hang on to that water is if you're very efficient and only provide the plant what it has to have. If you're doing overhead or irrigation, most of that water also gets lost because the sun evaporates, the plant evapotranspirates, all that moisture has a way of leaving the system. There's no way to hold on to that water if you're producing crop.
All right, a little bit about water and how we do vegetables. We're in September. We're at the end of this crop cycle. So you can see there's a little bit of detritus on the side. These are squash vines. These were essentially the row of squash went on right on top of this line. If I run this for 1.5 hours, I can get from end to end the equivalent of 1 acre-inch of water on each plant, because the plants are planted right next to the thing. 1 acre-inch per week is the average amount of water that most vegetable plants need. So that's my target, is 1 acre. If it doesn't rain, if I don't get an inch of rain in that week, then I have to turn this on for at least 1.5 hours, and I put it on a timer. I know that it takes me 1.5 hours, so I can come over here, and I've got many faucets there, so I can run 3 lines at one time off this thing for 1.5 hours. the major springs are up above everyone, and we can be assured that if we take care of it, we're going to have good water. Now the wells, many of them, they're not very productive, just not very productive at all. Using a drip irrigation system like this, you don't have to worry about any pollutants or things in the water getting on your plants. It's because you're putting it in at the roots. Say if you had E. coli or something in the water, which is a big problem. A food safety issue is a really big problem for us as vegetable growers.
Right.
We've heard all the controversy about the E. coli and listeria and muskmelons and things like that. Well, even us small-scale farmers need to be concerned about that. So if we have dirty water to start with, then we're already sort of behind the 8 ball, so to speak.
Exactly.
So by getting my water from a spring in my tank, it's a closed system, I know that it's clean. If you're using overhead irrigation, you can figure on you're going to lose about a third of it just in evaporation or whatever might interfere with its spread. I'm not watering the weeds here, I'm just watering the plants. And so that is a real energy savings there. And
if you have cattle on a landscape and you have a stream coming through the landscape, you have different choices you can make for how best to use the water which is given to you by people from upstream. One of them is you could put a pump in the stream, pump it to a box, and provide a safe, stable footing for those cattle, because it's been shown that cattle prefer a safe place to drink water than a place where they're down in a stream like this with their head down, where they're vulnerable to attack. Another way you could do this is you could take your stream, you could put a break in the fence so all your cattle can go to one spot to drink. And if you've ever noticed cattle, they always go to the highest place that they're able to. So if there's a fence, they always go to the top of the land near that fence, and that's where they prefer to drink, because they know, as much as cattle know anything, that that's the best water. So whether you pump water, whether you drill a well and pump water out of the fractured rock network, and a cattle can use a lot of water. A dairy cow will use 60 or 80 gallons of water in a day. So that's like a small town, and a lot of that water doesn't go back. That 80 gallons of water produces roughly 60 or 80 pounds of milk, 8.34 pounds per gallon, so you can do the math. So some of that water doesn't go back to the resource. The problem is one of quality. If you've got cattle who are mobbing a stream and they destroy the vegetation which lines the stream, which is what gives shade and also some filtration to the runoff, then you're losing your own banks due to stream bank erosion, you're sending sediment downstream which affects your neighbor's use of their property, and you're also losing your own land. Because what ends up happening is you've probably seen this across the county, there are places that have been so badly impacted by cattle that they won't grow grass anymore. So that's your choices. If you want to be a good steward of the landscape, you have to use your ability to observe and to notice what the effects are, and you have to make a decision. Do I want to spend money to make this better? And some people need to be forced to do that, and some people do this on their own volition.
I mean, like dairy cows, they probably drink maybe 30 or 40 gallons a day a piece, which they drink a lot. And you use it to wash your tank and so forth, to wash your milking equipment, and we catch it all. All the water goes into a pit, and we spread it all on the land. It goes into the same pit with the manure, and then we spread it on the land.
This is like our manure pond or manure pit, and it's the one that collects all the effluents from the calves. It's decomposing, and then we'll mix it up depending on the season. We usually try to do it fall, and
when we put in our fall crops after we've got our corn and hay in before winter time. We'll stir it all up and then spread it back on the ground. We've only got one well that we use, so all the rest of them have been developed springs.
Wow.
that are on the place, and so we've got them down to bedrock, and we went in and graveled them and tiled them so that we don't get any surface water contamination, and so we've got just on this place we've got probably about 5 or 6 or 7 different spring heads that we've got developed, and I'll take you to them. This is more or less just a holding tank, and you can see like I think it's a 2,000 gallon tank that we pumping water into so that we have a reserve anytime that we have a high demand. What we don't capture in our reservoirs from those springs, it's coming out and returning back to the stream. So anytime that we have a demand, then that we'll capture the water, and then it's just a circle that comes back. Whenever we develop a spring, we're getting it down to bedrock, so we're not getting any runoff from the top, from the ground, from above ground. We're getting like pure water that would go into the streams and work through the filters system naturally. We're getting down to that, and then we're capturing it, and then into the different reservoirs, and then the end product of what we don't use is coming back, and it's still just as pure as what it would be naturally. We're trying to do our part to keep the system pure all the way through. So we're living on the farm too, so we're living here and drinking the water, and so the better we can make it for ourselves, the better we can make it for everybody on down the stream. It helps everybody.
Springs are part of Floyd County, and so a lot of folks, when they moved here, they built their house near a spring because it was the best way of getting clean water. There's a special responsibility that comes with having a spring, because a spring is a two-way faucet. If you get water backing up on a spring, the water will go back into that fractured rock network, and it can cause you to contaminate your water and your neighbor's water.
Like I said, with the water only being 20 to 50 years old, contaminants are going to move quicker through the system. So whereas in like the coastal plain, stuff would move very, very, very slowly. In fractured rock, you can have contaminants move fast. So if water that you're pulling out of a well is only 20 years old, then that means if somebody, I don't know, dumped a bunch of motor oil down their well 20 years ago and it's connected to that well, then within 20 years you're going to start pulling that up, and probably a lot sooner.
So springs deserve special protection, and they have some protection under the law, but only once you develop them. But they deserve special protection in terms of development rights, because you could affect somebody's water. Let's say you built a pond on top of this. There was a pond built next to a daycare center in Copper Hill, which backed up over a spring, and the water that was in that pond was surface water, which was dirty. It had pet waste, it had animal waste in it, and it contaminated the water supply to the Copper Hill daycare center. So here we have a situation where a neighbor inadvertently impacted another neighbor, and there was no regulation to address the result or to prevent its effects. Depending on the season, there's at least 4 things that can happen to a raindrop. It can soak into the ground, it can run off the ground, it can be diverted and run off very fast, stormwater flash floods, it can be captured by a plant and evaporated, or it can be stored. Once water goes into the ground, there's different things that can happen. First off, we can affect how much water goes in the ground by what we're doing on the surface. If this pasture was very tightly grazed, more water would run off than if it's like it is now, where you have a very lush growth of very good grasses.
One of my biggest fears is to lose topsoil. We've got shallow soils here in the county anyway, so any soil loss is at a premium. So that's the most productive part of our land is topsoil. So we're trying to help preserve that and alternate with the hay or the alfalfa, help slow down that water flow during a rain event, and so that it's not carrying away the soil, so we can keep it right in the fields
where it's at. So, and that helps protect the streams, the sediment, and everything all the way down the line.
The issue is going to be, in the future, if we get periods of extreme drought or extreme wet, how do we attenuate those effects?
We're here at Floyd Eco Village, and this is an intentional community we built a few years ago. And we are trying to work on methods to be more sustainable, have less impact on the environment, to be a zero energy community, and to work with best practice for how people can live in a way that has lower impact on the environment. The building over here, all of the water off of that roof goes into cisterns. We have 8,000 gallons of stored water there, and that gets used for flushing toilets, for irrigation of the property. And then the buildings back here, they all have cisterns that are used for irrigation. And in this building we have the pond out back, which is our storage method there. And that pond is a way to store some water. It's a spring-fed pond, but it also has water that comes from the roof and the systems around the building. Okay. So that gives us a water storage method. It also provides a natural habitat for wildlife and things that will be beneficial to maintaining a diverse environment.
We feel like not only on our farm, but of the county, we need to help preserve and take care of our water source just as much today as we did thousands of years ago.
It's a really hard sell to get people to put time and effort into preventing things that they haven't experienced.
And my wife and I moved here in I moved here in 97. We moved out here to Goose Creek in 99, and part of the draw for this old house was not so much the house, which was worth saving after all, but the creeks. I mean, I think this water here in Goose Creek and Nameless Creek, if you look at the aquatic insect population, it's very healthy. It contains some indicator organisms that suggest this water is very clean. While not every stream in Floyd County is 100% pure, Goose Creek is fairly clean, partly because there are not many people living on it or near it. And one indication of its quality is the aquatic insect population that's much easier to find in the summer. But the stoneflies, like this one, caddisflies, mayflies, and one little creature is my favorite called the water penny, is an indication that the water is very, very clean. And we certainly hope it's going to stay that way.
Okay, so what I'd really like to show you here is a comparison between what nature does and what humans like to do. So here we have the marsh, and this is a mountain marsh, very important because there just aren't very many of them. Most times water just flows off the mountains. But here the beavers have dammed up the water and kept this whole area in a marsh. And so you see a great variety of different kinds of wildlife that come into this area. Right here we can see the different kinds of goldenrod and asters and flowers that are blooming right now in the fall. These attract our pollinators, and our pollinators are needed for our garden plants as well as for our fruit trees. We don't get fruit unless we have bees of different kinds. And the marsh keeps those flowers here and has different kinds of flowers throughout the season. And so we need that biodiversity. We need it to be here. We need to protect it. And the beavers are a main part. They're actually called a keystone species because they keep this as a marsh. And if you cut it down, the water flows off too rapidly. It doesn't stay. And so what I want to look at over here on the other side of the road is what you see is what people do. And so there's great big culverts that bring the water from the marsh over onto this land here. We can see the water comes out on this side. And this is what humans tend to do with our land. We tend to not like those bees, and we are afraid of those snakes and worried about the lions and the tigers and the bears that could be in there. And so we clear cut our land, and we make this nice grassy knoll, and we think it looks so nice, and it does. It's instinctive. It's instinctive. This spot here is not going to get us like the wildlife does. But what we have done in clearing this land is the water now flows through here, and it's not held back. And so it runs off in a ditch. So we've turned this natural wildlife system into a ditch where the water runs off rapidly. It will leave this area. It doesn't soak much in if it's flowing through a ditch. And so instead of ditches, we need more marshes. And we can have a balance of that. It doesn't have to be exactly one or the other. We don't have to have everything look like that, and we don't have to have everything look like that. We can actually have nice, big, wide pathways through a beautiful marsh here. And you could have a much better, more beautiful system by not killing it all, by having a diversity here as well as there.
What's interesting to me is that there's a lot of folks in Floyd County who talk about cleaning up their stream banks. The problem with cleaning up your stream bank is that you remove the root mass, you remove the vegetation, which is what breaks the falling rain and the running off rain, and so those banks become unstable. And usually what happens is you'll have a grass to an edge, the edge drops straight off, and then that undercutting force of the stream keeps on carving off chunks which fall into the stream and get carried off downstream. I'm not saying this as a scientist, I'm saying this as an observant person.
Right.
Anybody can look at a landscape and say, here is an effect which I'd like to change. And what usually happens is people don't change that effect until it affects them directly. Their driveway washes out, their garage falls into the creek, they lose a bale of hay or a piece of equipment, a cow delivers a calf and the calf drowns. Those are things which cause people to take stock. Well, there's other things we should be warned about, which have to do with how much sediment, how much coliform load, how much stormwater runoff, and how fast water leaves the surface, which means it's not recharging, but rather it's leaving the system, which should all make us take stock of when do we want to intervene on a landscape to improve the behavior of the landscape in response to the stress which was brought on by us. It wouldn't be stressed if it was trees. It's stressed because we changed something and we changed it for our benefit. So set aside a little bit of money, a little bit of thought to how do you improve, how do you counter the effect, because I think that is actually part of the consideration in stewardship.
And unfortunately, much of our tax-based system and our economy-based system is I could get a whole lot more money by cutting this forest down and turning it into a cow pasture than by leaving it as a forest. And this land I could probably get well over $100,000 to cut down my old trees and make it into a pasture, and then I get a tax break if it was a pasture. So it's really pretty sad, and that's one of the destructions of our water supply as well. It's not just the trees. And it's the biodiversity. The biodiversity here is much different in an old forest. As you can, when you have an old forest, you've got old trees that woodpeckers can live in and insects can grow in. When they fall to the ground and you leave them on the ground, there's a whole different set of fungi and insects that live in those things than do in a young pine forest. Imagine the system of roots that this has that's been here for hundreds of years. And those roots are so important to the conduit of water. As it hits this tree and it comes down here, it holds on to that water, it sends it deep into the mountain and preserves it right here in Floyd County into our groundwater. And these trees should be everywhere. They should be all over our mountains. Everybody, is surprised at how huge this tree is, but it should be commonplace. Yeah. And these won't ever be if people keep cutting down their old forest. We really need a preservation system for that. And so this whole ecosystem, the biodiversity of here, helps to preserve not only, of course, the land itself, but the water supply. So it's important not just for the absorption of the water, but for cleaning the water.
It has been so long since the last drops fell that when they come, if they come, they will be a liquid miracle, a holy gift, the ordinary become extraordinary for its scarcity. Later in the morning they did come. 3 large fat drops were splatted on the walk outside the porch door, but God was not in the cloud. And those few drops were followed by nothing but a high, hot wind. Somewhere in heaven overhead it was raining while dust devils danced along the edges of my garden, taunting and cruel. 3 drops, better than none at all, I suppose. I lay down shirtless on the stone walkway outside the back door and watched the dry wind draw exaggerated demons and cherub and shades of slate and pewter. But a gray, flat, featureless rain cloud would have been the most angelic and beatific vision of all.
Probably the biggest single thing that could be done in relation to recharge in Floyd County is agricultural policy. It's how we open the land, the density of forage for animals, the way that we either do contour plowing or not, and it's a very important issue. Not only for water, but for the health of the soils and erosion and all these things.
If you have these malfunctioning septic systems, you can get groundwater contamination from it, and there are plenty of cases of this happening. But it's hard when people have never had an experience with contamination to convince them that they need to try to prevent it. Giles County is an example where they had their public well all of a sudden started to have super high levels of fecal coliform, and so they had to build a really, really expensive filtration plant to deal with this. Years after this, they took an old section of town that was all private septic systems, and they put it on public sewer. So all those septic systems became inactive, and the fecal coliform went away from the well.
So how much storage capacity exists in the fractured rock system of Floyd County, nobody really knows. And that's something to consider when you think about the possible growth in the future of Floyd County. It's a place that's easy to love, but it only has a limited carrying capacity, more from the water limitations than the land limitations.
Leadership needs to take into consideration zoning, planning, development, not only near term but in future term, because what we do today will affect our water quality for centuries. So my biggest fear is in the community that a big industry or a big entity that would come in and throw their money around and force their will, flash money, and maybe not have the economic won't have the economic incentives to take care of Floyd County, and yet take our resources and not take care of them.
All you can do is manage, right? In a place like Floyd, you're not going to fix anything short of completely going off groundwater and going down and pumping water out of the little river, which they've talked about. The only thing to do is manage, and the least expensive thing to do is manage.
As Gary just said, the DEQ they monitor where they can monitor around the state, but there's always other places that they can't monitor, and so citizens can create groups to monitor places. There are protocols out there designed for volunteers, non-professionals, and there's a process in the state for you to feed that information to the DEQ, and that'll go into what they say as their assessment. Every 2 years it'll come out.
A couple of years ago, somebody pushed a 55-gallon drum of waste oil into Goose Creek, about a half mile upstream, and it made me very angry. I'm still angry when I think about it.
Did you like smell it?
I smelled it when I crossed the creek, and I went and called DEQ, and they came out and managed to clean most of it up. And I tried to find out where, you know, it might have come from, but didn't have any luck.
So having a base of people in the town already who are already motivated and already aware of the risks and concerns is a huge help, and I think that's one of the biggest keys to any of these plans being successful. Because they're not a mandate, they're not supposed to come down from on high, they're not supposed to come down from a government level, they're supposed to be, you know, we're supposed to just assist them in putting this plan together, and then it's up to the town itself to implement and to do outreach and education. And so without that sort of motivation, these things just flounder and go away. So that's really, really key. Because there's nobody that's going to take interest in Floyd's water or any of these small, you know, rural public water systems in Virginia. Nobody has any interest. Only the people that live there. So they're the ones that have to take ownership and make a difference.
You know, as much as I enjoy living in this place, I try very hard to avoid the notion that this is my land. We paid for this land to use it, to borrow it, to take care of it, to be stewards for however long we're given here. But I'm under the obligation to leave this place at least as good as I found it, if not better. We don't really own the land any more than we own the oxygen that we breathe. We take it in, we use it, it makes us alive, and we give it back.
We drink that water, and it is part of that system. We eat the foods that have to be pollinated by these bees, and all the trees help to send our water down into the earth. We need the entire system. And if we kill it off, if we constantly mow it away, if we constantly put out factories to make our Coca-Cola and things like that, we do not absolutely need. If we make these things that made in factories that we don't really need, we are killing the earth, and eventually it will kill us too. And so the water is, of course, a very important system in that. The air, everything, it's all part of this intricate spider web that we cannot live without, simply cannot live without. Homo sapiens is a most amazing creature on the earth. We've got these wonderful, huge brains, and it is our greatest asset and our biggest demise because we have been able to do so many things and travel to the moon, and yet it has made us so able to kill off nature in such a way that we are keeping ourselves alive, but eventually nature is what feeds us.
I barely noticed the commotion rushing up our valley from the south, another dry wind, as the warmth from the stone walkway sedated me into a dehydrated, daydreaming stupor. Then, sudden, sustained and smelling of dust and ozone, the blessed rain came. It swept in sheets up the valley toward the house, passing over me where I lay, supine and supplicant in baptism. It is raining still. And this afternoon we walked in it, waded in it, rejoiced in it. How frail we are in that cellular sea inside us, plant and animal alike. We're filled by rains and rivers that we do not own, that we cannot invoke by word or by law. We live on a water planet, but it's all too easy to think of this miraculous liquid as ordinary. I hope I will never again think of it as ordinary or complain about it when it comes once more in glorious excess.
I'm bowled over by Floyd. I think it is absolutely extraordinary. And I could feel that there is an enormous possibility of doing things. The one thing that is really incredibly interesting phenomenologically is that there's no watershed here. And so then where's the watershed? It's within the humanity.